Yemen's president's hit out at Israel and the United States, saying they are behind the unrest sweeping his country. There are more demonstrations in the Yemeni capital, calling for President Ali Abdullah Saleh to step down. A senior Yemeni cleric has become the latest high-profile figure to join the anti-government movement. France's new foreign minister's officially taken up the job. Alain Juppé replaced Michel Alliot-Marie, who was forced to resign. She faced criticism over following revelations that she holidayed in Tunisia and had ties with the ousted leader, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. A week since the terrible earthquake in New Zealand, and a moment's silence in the city of Christchurch. More than 150 people died, but the death toll could be as high as 240. The French fashion house Christian Dior's fired its creative director, John Galliano, after pictures emerged of the designer praising Hitler and making anti-Semitic comments. And this was days after the fashion house suspended him, pending an investigation for another similar incident. They said his behaviour was particularly odious. Now time for Riz Khan on Al Jazeera.
Hello and welcome. As women joined men in the street protests across the Arab world, how much are they falling victim to the usual stereotype reporting of gender issues in the Western media? Women have always played a part in shaping the region, but their role in society has often been misunderstood. Many Western commentators marveled at the recent sight of women protesters in Tunisia, Egypt and Libya, prompting critics to point out that these pundits were caught off guard by their own stereotype views. The typical portrayal is of passive Arab women, usually repressed by religious dogma, with no voice in society. But the reality is that women have been active political players in trade unions and grassroots organizations in the region for many decades. So today we ask, what role are Arab women playing in shaping the future of their countries? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Well, we're joined by Rabab El-Mahdi, Professor of Political Science at the American University in Cairo. Last year, she co-edited the prophetically entitled Egypt, the Moment of Change, which describes the growing internal pressures that the Mubarak regime faced over the last few years. It explores the role of Islam in society and the growing social movements for democratic change in Egypt. Joining me from Duke University is sociologist Dr. Frances Hasso, Associate Professor of Women's Studies and International Comparative Studies, and author of Resistance, Repression and Gender Politics in Occupied Palestine and Jordan. Also with us is Professor Nadia Al-Ali, a social anthropologist and director of the Center for Gender Studies at the School of African and Oriental Studies at the University of London. Her book, Secularism, Gender and the State in the Middle East, explores the Egyptian women's movement. She's also written extensively about Iraqi women after the US-led invasion. I welcome you all to the show, and I will start with Cairo, if I may, and Professor Rabab Al-Mahdi. Let me start by asking about the way the Western media is turning its eyes on the Middle East with all the recent upheavals to watch the protests. And I know you've been asked a lot of questions which frustrate you immensely. Give me examples of the kind of things that you're getting that come across so naive.
I mean, starting from the question of the role of women in the revolution, as opposed, you'd never ask the question, the role of men in the revolution, right? And then how do you think that the Muslim Brotherhood coming out now to the political life would end up putting women in a much more disadvantaged position than they already are? And lastly, the question or the pleasant surprise when people came to Tahrir, when journalists came to Tahrir, and they're like, oh, so there are women, and there are veiled women who go out protesting. And they're frustrating, and sometimes those questions are absolutely insulting.
So then give me an idea of what you feel the real picture in Egypt is when it comes to the current situation for women there.
I think when we look at this uprising or revolution, whatever you're going to call it, we need to address the fact that women have participated just as men have participated. They have not participated based on a gender-based agenda. They've participated on common themes to do with democratization, to do with a change in economic policies, against neoliberalism, against torture, against common themes that they, as women, chose to put forward as their priority. They believe, and that's their agency, and that's their right. If we're talking about women agency, we should respect the fact that they would choose at specific moments of history to mobilize on things other than their gender specifically, but how those broader themes of democracy, of neoliberalism, have actually had different implications for them as women. Well, and I think if we're sincere about being feminists of a sort, we have to respect that choice.
Well, let me bring in Dr. Frances Hasso here and welcome you in and ask you, I mean, you know, there is really obviously in reality, a lot of room for improvement, for the lives of women in the Middle East. Now, I wonder what real change you think these uprisings will bring.
Well, I think we need to remember that even that category of women in the Middle East is very broad, and as Rabab mentioned, for example, neoliberalism has had a very negative impact on both men and women. And if you think about peasant women, working class women, women living in rural areas, they're going to want different things than women who are maybe highly educated and urban. And I do think, however, that we need to keep in mind that that the economic issues, the question of imperialism, the question of neoliberalism can't really be disconnected from the issues of gender, and they'll work themselves out in really different ways for different kinds of women. I mean, as I think about these revolutions, which are very exciting, I also know that many revolutions work out in a way that really leaves some people behind, leaves some women behind, leaves many men behind. And we would want to make sure. Go ahead.
I was going to say, then let me ask you then, Dr. Hasso, how, in terms of the protests in Tunisia and Egypt, for example, where they've run that much longer, how inclusive are those calls for change? Is it just about taking down the regime, or do you see some genuine desire for change across all aspects of society, whether it's issues or economics, issues of gender or economics?
Yes, I actually see an emergent kind of politics on the streets in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in other places. And I think people are, the calls for dignity, for freedom, for social justice, as soon as you make those kinds of calls, you have to think, well, freedom for who, social justice for who, dignity for who. And I think people are cognizant, maybe more than at any other time, that if you're going to make those kinds of calls, then you're going to have to include everybody. I also think you have to be careful, because they could be defined in a very restrictive way that actually does exclude people. And we know that women, and again generalizing for a minute, that women have been excluded actually by secular, communist, and Islamist political movements in various ways. I mean, even within those movements, they've struggled in various ways to be sure that their voices and that their desires are included.
Well, let me bring in Professor Nadia Al-Ali.